Picture yourself as a peasant in the 12th century, accused of a crime you never committed. To prove your innocence, you must grasp a red-hot iron bar with your bare hands. If your wounds heal within 3 days, God stands by your side. If not, well, your fate is sealed. Welcome to trial by ordeal, where justice was determined not by evidence, but by the supernatural. In medieval times, justice looked nothing like what we know today. There were no lawyers strutting through courtrooms, no juries deliberating in chambers, and certainly no forensic investigations. Instead, feudal lords and the church turned to extreme measures to determine guilt or innocence. These so-called trials by ordeal were divine tests where the accused faced brutal challenges, all based on the belief that God would step in to protect the innocent. Think about it. You're standing there, your heart pounding, as a priest blesses the iron bar heating in the flames. The crowd watches in hushed anticipation. Your entire future, your very life, depends not on facts or witnesses, but on how your flesh reacts to searing metal. This wasn't some rare occurrence, it was justice as medieval people knew it. The fascinating part? These ordeals were actually conducted with elaborate ceremonies. Before any trial, the accused would fast and pray for 3 days. Priests would perform sacred rituals, blessing the instruments of trial with holy water and special prayers. The whole community would gather to witness what they believed was divine judgment in action. If you love unraveling the mysteries of history's greatest empires, join us on the Medieval Archives. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of the darkest chapters of medieval justice. Let's dive into a world where faith, fear, and fate intertwined to decide the destiny of countless souls. Trial by ordeal, known as God's judgment, was the medieval world's most dramatic form of justice. Imagine walking into a church where priests and nobles gather to watch as your fate is decided not by evidence or testimony, but by how well you survive a horrific test. These trials were based on a simple yet terrifying belief: God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Let me tell you about the most common methods, and trust me, they're as brutal as they sound. First, there was the trial by fire. The accused would have to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces across a church floor. Sometimes they'd have to walk across burning plowshares or plunge their hands into boiling water to retrieve a blessed ring. After 3 days, if their wounds showed signs of healing, they were declared innocent. If the wounds festered, well, the gallows awaited. Then there was the fascinating trial by water, which had a twisted logic all its own. The accused would be bound and thrown into a river or lake. Here's the bizarre part. If you sank, you were considered innocent because the pure water had accepted you. If you floated, you were guilty because the water had rejected your sinful body. Yes, you heard that right. The innocent would sink and potentially drown. Sometimes they'd pull you out if you sank, but not always quick enough. But perhaps the most spectacular of all was trial by combat, or judicial duel. 2 men would fight to the death, believing God would strengthen the arm of the innocent and weaken the guilty. These weren't just quick skirmishes. They were elaborate affairs that could last hours. Nobles could hire champions to fight for them, but common folk had to fight their own battles. There's a fascinating story about a trial in France where a man accused of murder had to fight against his own neighbor while both were armed with wooden clubs and shields. Here's something most people don't know. The clergy were forbidden to shed blood, so they developed their own special ordeal, the trial of the blessed bread and cheese. The accused had to swallow a large piece of bread and cheese that had been blessed by a priest. If they choked or couldn't swallow, they were guilty. Imagine trying to eat while knowing your life depends on not getting a piece stuck in your throat. These trials weren't just random acts of cruelty. They were deeply woven into the fabric of medieval society, where faith and justice were inseparable. The accused would prepare for days, fasting and praying, truly believing that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent. The whole community would gather to witness these events. making them as much about public spectacle as they were about justice. Let's talk about the power players who held life and death in their hands during medieval times. Who were these people who could decide whether you'd face burning iron or freezing water to prove your innocence? It was a fascinating partnership between two mighty forces, the feudal lords and the church. Picture a medieval court in session. On one side, you'd have the feudal lord sitting on his carved wooden chair, dressed in fine clothing, perhaps wearing a sword at his side. These nobles had absolute power over their territories, handling everything from petty theft to murder cases. They could order executions, demand fines, or show mercy, all at their whim. Some lords were known for their wisdom, others for their cruelty. But here's where it gets interesting. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a legal powerhouse. Priests didn't just pray, they were active participants in these trials. Let me tell you about one of the most famous cases that still haunts historians today. Tancred of Verona, a respected knight with a spotless reputation, found himself accused of treason. Now, being a nobleman, he had the right to demand trial by combat. The day of the duel, the whole city gathered to watch. Tancred fought against his accuser's champion, a professional fighter who had won numerous such duels before. The fight was brutal, lasting several hours under the hot Italian sun. Despite his skill and reputation, Tancred lost the battle and was executed immediately after. But here's the twist that makes historians question this system. Years later, documents were found suggesting the accusations against him were fabricated by political rivals. His death wasn't justice, it was murder dressed up as legal procedure. Something most people don't know is that medieval judges often had no formal legal training. Many couldn't even read or write. They relied on memory, tradition, and sometimes just their gut feelings. There's a fascinating record from England where a local lord would flip a coin when he couldn't decide a case. Heads for guilty, tails for innocent. Of course, he claimed the coin was blessed by a priest, so it was still technically a divine judgment. The relationship between these powers wasn't always smooth sailing. Sometimes lords would try to override church authority, and sometimes priests would refuse to participate in certain ordeals they deemed too cruel. It was a delicate dance of power, with the accused caught in the middle, hoping that either worldly or divine justice would see the truth of their innocence. Now let's delve into the fascinating and often mind-boggling logic behind these ordeals. To our modern minds, it might seem completely insane, but to medieval people, there was a complex spiritual reasoning behind every trial. Take the water ordeal, for example. The medieval mind saw water as one of God's purest elements. After all, it was used in baptism to wash away sins. Their reasoning went like this: pure water would naturally reject anything impure, including sinners and criminals. So, if you floated, it meant the water was refusing to accept you into its embrace. They believed the devil himself was keeping you afloat, marking you as one of his own. Pretty clever thinking, right? Well, until you consider the horrific catch-22 this created. Here's where it gets really dark. If you were innocent and sank, you might well drown before they could pull you out. And if you were guilty and floated, you'd face an even more terrible fate: burning at the stake. It was quite literally a death sentence either way. Imagine the terror of being bound and thrown into freezing water, knowing that whether you float or sink, you're probably not walking away. But here's something that might surprise you. These trials weren't always meant to determine actual guilt or innocence. They were often used as a form of social pressure. Many accused people would confess before the ordeal, preferring a known punishment to risking divine judgment. The threat of ordeal was sometimes more powerful than the ordeal itself. Did you know that in England, right up until the 13th century, priests would perform elaborate ceremonies before water ordeals? They would bless the water with special prayers, asking it to reject the wicked and embrace the pure. These ceremonies could last hours, building tension and fear in both the accused and the spectators. The priests would walk around the water 3 times, sprinkling holy water and chanting ancient prayers. They even had a specific prayer that went, "Let not the water receive the body of him who, being freed from the weight of goodness, is upborne by the water." Even more fascinating is how some clever priests would sometimes manipulate these trials. There are records of them slightly heating the iron bar for nobles they favored, or secretly blessing accused people they believed were innocent with special oils that might protect against burns. Some historians believe these priests were actually trying to insert a bit of real justice into a fundamentally flawed system. Before we move on to our next topic, I'd love to hear from you. Would you have the courage to face a trial by ordeal? What would you choose if you had to pick between the burning iron and the freezing water? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the past. Hit that like button if you're as fascinated by medieval justice as we are. And here's a mind-bending thought to leave you with. In some cases, people actually survived these ordeals and were declared innocent. How do you think they managed that? We'll explore some theories in our next videos, so make sure you're subscribed to find out. The year 1215 marked a turning point in medieval justice, though perhaps not as dramatic as one might think. Picture this. Hundreds of church leaders gathered in Rome for the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most important religious meetings of the Middle Ages. Among discussions of crusades and religious reforms, they made a decision that would change the face of justice forever. Trial by ordeal was officially banned. But why did the church suddenly change its mind after centuries of supporting these trials? The answer is fascinating. Church leaders had begun to question whether it was appropriate to force God to reveal his judgment on command. They argued that demanding divine intervention was essentially putting God to the test, a sin in itself. Imagine the irony. The very system meant to reveal God's will was now considered an offense against him. Here's where it gets interesting. The end of ordeals created a huge problem. How do you determine guilt or innocence without divine intervention? This void led to the gradual development of what we might recognize as more modern legal procedures. Courts began relying on human judges, witness testimonies, and written evidence. The revolutionary concept of reasonable doubt started to take shape. But let me tell you a secret that most history books gloss over. The transition wasn't as clean or complete as you might think. In many remote villages and smaller fiefdoms, feudal lords still held absolute power over their subjects. They might not have been throwing people into rivers anymore, but justice remained far from fair. Peasants could still be condemned on a lord's whim, only now without the theatrical element of divine intervention. There's a fascinating case from 1320 in France, where a village tried to secretly conduct a trial by hot iron, decades after it was banned. When church authorities discovered it, the whole village was excommunicated. People had become so accustomed to supernatural justice that they struggled to trust purely human judgment. The most remarkable change was in England, where the end of ordeals led to the development of the jury system. But here's the twist. Early juries weren't quite what we have today. These first jurors were actually local people who were supposed to already know about the crime and the accused. They were more like witnesses than impartial judges of fact. Imagine being tried by 12 of your neighbors who knew all your secrets. Some areas found creative replacements for ordeals. In parts of Germany, they developed the trial of the beer, where a suspected murderer had to touch the corpse of their alleged victim. If the body bled, twitched, or showed any changes, the suspect was considered guilty. Less physically dangerous than ordeals, perhaps, but hardly more scientific. The end of official ordeals didn't mean the end of superstition in justice. Throughout Europe, people continued to believe in divine signs of guilt well into the 17th century. The infamous witch trials that would come centuries later showed that the human desire to find supernatural proof of guilt hadn't disappeared. It had just taken new forms. So while 1215 officially ended trial by ordeal, the path to modern justice was long and winding, filled with fascinating attempts to balance human judgment with divine authority. In many ways, we're still wrestling with questions of how to determine absolute truth in matters of justice. We've just traded hot irons and blessed water for forensic science and legal procedures. Just when you thought medieval justice couldn't get any stranger, let me tell you about one of the most bizarre ordeals ever devised: the trial of the cursed cheese and bread, also known as the Corsned ordeal. Yes, you heard that right. People's lives literally depended on their ability to swallow cheese without choking. Here's how this peculiar trial worked. A priest would take a piece of cheese and a chunk of barley bread, bless them with special prayers, and sometimes even place them on the church altar overnight. The next day, the accused would have to eat this blessed food in front of the entire community. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, there was a catch. They believed that if you were guilty, God would cause you to choke or gag on the food. The fascinating part is that this ordeal was especially popular among the clergy themselves. Since religious officials weren't supposed to participate in violent ordeals, they developed this supposedly more humane alternative. But imagine the psychological pressure. You're standing there trying to swallow cheese while an entire congregation watches your every gulp, waiting for any sign of difficulty. There's an amazing story from Anglo-Saxon England about a priest accused of murder who underwent the cheese ordeal. According to the chronicles, he declared, "May this cheese choke me if I committed the murder." The poor fellow ended up choking so severely that his face turned blue, which was taken as definitive proof of his guilt. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. The cheese used wasn't just any ordinary cheese. It was usually aged and quite dry, making it particularly challenging to swallow. Some historians believe the priests would deliberately choose the driest, most crumbly cheese they could find for suspected criminals they believed were guilty. There are even records of them adding blessed herbs or spices to make the mixture even more difficult to swallow. But here's the truly ironic part. Stress and anxiety can naturally trigger difficulty swallowing, so the more terrified you were of choking, even if completely innocent, the more likely you were to actually choke. It was a cruel psychological trap that played on the deepest human fears. The ceremony itself was quite elaborate. Before the trial, the accused had to fast for 24 hours, making their throat dry and their nerves even more frayed. The priest would intone specific prayers, including one that went something like, "Let this cheese reveal the truth that lies hidden in this person's heart." Sometimes they would even write sacred words on the cheese itself. This ordeal was so infamous that it actually gave rise to an Old English phrase, "to swallow the ordeal," meaning to undergo a difficult test. Next time someone tells you to take something with a grain of salt, you might want to remind them it could be worse. At least you're not taking it with a chunk of cursed cheese. What makes this ordeal particularly fascinating is how it reveals the medieval mindset. They truly believed that everyday objects, when blessed by the church, could become instruments of divine justice. It shows how deeply intertwined religion, justice, and daily life were in medieval society. Even something as simple as eating cheese could become a matter of life and death. The brutal reality of trial by ordeal reveals a medieval justice system steeped in cruelty, arbitrary decisions, and superstition. When we look at these practices today, it's easy to shake our heads in disbelief. But let's pause for a moment and reflect. Are we really so different in our modern times? Think about how quick we are to judge others on social media, how we sometimes condemn people based on rumors and speculation without waiting for actual evidence. The medieval peasant facing the hot iron ordeal and today's person facing trial by public opinion might have more in common than we'd like to admit. History teaches us a powerful lesson here. Whether it's the 12th century or the 21st, a flawed justice system can turn anyone into a victim. The only real difference is that we've traded hot irons and blessed cheese for hashtags and viral posts. But there's hope in this dark tale. Just as medieval society eventually moved beyond ordeals, we too can strive for a more just world, one where evidence, not superstition or snap judgments, determines truth. One where we take the time to understand before we condemn. I'm Richard from the Medieval Archives, and if this journey through the dark corridors of medieval justice has sparked your curiosity, there's so much more to explore. Hit that subscribe button to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends who love a good historical tale as much as you do. Next week, we'll be diving into the fascinating world of medieval medicine. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Until then, remember, the past isn't just a collection of strange stories. It's a mirror that reflects our own society in surprising ways. This is the Medieval Archives, where history comes alive. See you in our next adventure through time.